Hello. So today we're going to be having a look at the week 2 PowerPoint. So we're going to introduce PHP, kind of how to use it, how to apply it. Understand that the majority of the application of these principles is going to be presented in the lab for the week. It's pretty long, it's pretty involved. But here I'm just going to talk you through some of the content. This is an intimidating week, probably as much as any of the weeks. So if it seems frustrating, if you're wondering whether this is going to work for you, I think those are kind of natural thoughts this week. As you'll see, the PHP syntax, PHP is just a programming language. The syntax language from one programming language to another is not generally a really hard transition. But for many of you, this is going to be your first server-side language, and that is the challenge of what we're going to talk about this week. So a little syntax, some clunky examples, and you'll see. All right. So PHP. So far, all we've talked about is just putting static content on the web, and there's a good chance that's all you've ever done. PHP is a server-side language, and so roughly what that means is it's going to give you the ability to create websites which are capable of interacting with the user. Now, whether that is responding to information that was entered on a form or pulling up a customized page. Those are the kind of things you do. So generally speaking, things you do with PHP might be you might be storing something in a database or fetching something from a database or just quite simply processing input on the screen, which is what we're focusing on this week. Pretty soon we'll be getting to the database part of things. So PHP is a weird thing because it stands for a couple things. Like when it was created, it stood for one thing, right? So we're talking about personal homepage, and oftentimes these days we say it stands for hypertext preprocessor. I'm not going to get too nitpicky with the definition because you could have a big discussion about it. Just Google it, you'll see what I mean. Kind of stands for several things. Just understand that it's a server-side language. It is object-oriented. I do realize you probably don't know what object-oriented programming is. That ends up being just out of the range of this class. It's loosely typed. Another word for that is interpreted. That means there are not concrete data types. Functions are not case-sensitive. So like, let's say you had a function called isNumeric, right? Capital I, lowercase I, doesn't matter. That sounds probably fairly intuitive, but when you couple that with the idea that variable names are case sensitive, well, that is just kind of a hard pill to swallow. So my best advice for you is you should just pretend that everything's case sensitive. It's not all case sensitive, but if you pretend that it is, it won't hurt you, because sometimes it is. Probably the most fundamental thing to talk about in PHP is the opening PHP tag. So PHP is an interesting thing because when you use it, it's probably embedded in the middle of some HTML, and you go in and out of PHP with these tags here, right? That's an opening PHP tag. That's a closing PHP tag. There are other opening and closing PHP tags. There's a short form. There's like a normal form, which is what that is, and there's a long form. Short form's a bad idea. Depending on how your web server is configured, you may be able to get away with short form. Short form is just that. Sometimes you can get away with it, but normally you can't, so don't do it. And then there's a long form, which is just unnecessary. So that's the form you should use. You are free to go in and out wherever you want. So that's the absolute beginning. We'll talk about variables a little bit. So when you want to declare a variable in PHP, pretty easy. There's no keyword for declaring the variable. Right? We don't even have to assign it a type. I'm just telling you that if you want to make a variable name, you need to start with a $sign. It's pretty ugly to look at, right? Who likes typing special characters? Not me, but that is the syntax. So if you write $sign something, well, you just created a variable, right? We don't assign it a type. There's no keywords. Just if it's a $sign, it's a variable. So the rules are kind of standard. Must start with a $sign. Second character of the variable has to be a character, a letter or an underscore. So no numbers. It is case sensitive. No special characters. Those are kind of normal rules. I put air quotes around that for naming variables. Excuse me. Camel casing is a good idea. Camel casing is that idea where like your first word is lowercase and every new word, which is part of the variable name, is uppercase. Underscores are fine. Some people like underscores. I don't like underscores. If you want to use underscores, go ahead and knock yourself out. Me, I always camel case things. Camel case would be that. I prefer that. not terribly important. So let's talk about PHP data types. This is kind of a weird discussion, but even when data types aren't particularly important, like in this language, I still like to talk about them. So these are the types that are built into PHP, but you don't ever need to explicitly declare them, so it's just not that interesting. So Boolean, right? But I like to talk about this because some of you are newer to programming, some of you are less confident with this than others, so it's a fine discussion. Boolean is a variable which is either set to true or false. Sometimes they're called flags. Integer is a whole number. In PHP, sometimes you call them float, sometimes you call them double. That is the data type you're going to use if you have decimals in a number, right? Like 3.5. Integers are whole numbers like 6. Strings are used to store usually words. You can store anything as a string. The thing about strings, though, is like you could store the number 7 as a string, but you can't do math with it. Generally, strings are things like names and whatever, something along those lines. Arrays are probably something that's new to you. An array is kind of a special data type. It's kind of interesting because we will talk about arrays today. You just can't get anywhere in PHP without talking about arrays. But it's kind of weird because we're going to be using arrays, but we're not going to be creating arrays, if that makes sense. We create arrays in the second section of this course. An object is another data type. Sorry for those coughs. I don't know what's up with my throat. Just something. And null is a data type loosely. It's kind of nothing, right? Kind of how it sounds. I'll show you some examples in a minute here. Actually, so let's go look at my examples and tell you what I can tell you. All right, so here's a little demo. Notice right here, this looks a lot like a boilerplate, right? Everything from there to there, that's literally just pure boilerplate HTML. And then I go into PHP mode here. And I end PHP mode right here. And notice there's a form down below it. But notice how that PHP is just planted right in the middle of the page. There's no rules about where your PHP needs to be. If your PHP is well organized, it's going to be in large chunks, but you can have PHP all over the page. So here's a little demo. This is showing you kind of a couple things. We haven't talked about echo yet, but basically this is clearly HTML, which is going to be displayed in the browser. PHP is not displayed in the browser generally. But if you do echo, that means, hey, I want to display this to the browser. So what this means is, hey, print out that H3, which says demo1, in the browser. Notice this line right here, this is PHP. I'm hoping you can look at that and tell me what that means. That's a variable called myvar. I know it's a variable because it starts with a $, and it's assigned a value of 8. Notice there's no keywords, no anything. I also want to tell you right now that doesn't print anything out. That does not produce any output. That's just programming. That is output. You know what output looks like because it has an echo in front of it. That is output as well. All right, just trying to put a little bit of context on things because I've been talking. So we just talked about these data types. They're one of those things that exist underneath or behind the scenes, but you're not really going to deal with them explicitly, generally speaking. So we talked a little bit about declaring variables. Another part of variables is assigning them values. When you declare a variable, you generally want to assign it a value. You can assign it a value later. It's usually best to assign the value right away. So this right here would be declaring a variable called age and giving it a value of 30. Note the semicolon. So every statement in PHP is followed by a semicolon. I don't know what language you have experience in, but some don't have semicolons. This one does. Most languages do have semicolons. This is a variable called price with a value of 17.95. This is a variable called name with a value of Steve. This is a variable with a name of value and a value of 21.50. This is a variable called isCorrect with a value of true. Now the more interesting thing about this is let's talk about types. Notice I don't specify types, they're inferred. So PHP is just going to guess what it is. This, if you were to guess, is a integer, right? It's a whole number. This is a double or a float, right? It has decimals in it. This is a string because it's a literal value. You're not going to do math with it. This right here is a tricky one, I guess. I have to do something a little bit tricky. This looks like a double or a float because it's a number with a decimal point in it. However, it is wrapped in quotes, which makes it a string. And this right here is set to true, and so that is a Boolean. Just showing you how that works. Notice we don't specify the types, but underneath the scenes, they do exist behind the scenes. All right, so talk about naming variables. Like I said, some of you are probably finding this pretty tedious, but do understand there are people that want to learn PHP and don't know a whole lot about programming. This isn't the best, probably, absolute starting point, but if it is, I'm trying to do what I can. So let's say I wanted to make a variable to represent some guy named Carl's height in inches. So a good name for that would be, whatever. I mean, you could, if you want to be wordy, you could be Carl height inches. That's called camel casing. Notice I'm using some abbreviations. X is a horrible name. You need to use descriptive names. Now, there's not going to be some variable police that are going to tell you your variable names are bad, but I'm going to be looking at your code. And if your code is not perfect, I need to be able to look at it and determine what you're trying to do. So I showed you a name for that. For Carl's height in centimeters, maybe I'd call that Carl HT centimeters, or you could just do HT cm, just lots of abbreviations. I'm not a big fan of that. I mean, I probably could figure out that might be height in centimeters, but if there's any doubt in what your variables are representing, you're doing it wrong. So try and be descriptive. These are just weird things to make variables out of. Grams of fat in a Whopper, maybe like Whopper GM fat. Right, like that's pretty straightforward. Also, don't get hung up on the order of the words. Just be descriptive, whatever the best thing you can do is. Big Mac fat. I'm just making things up. There's not just one answer here. Number of students in a class. Oftentimes when I do this one in class, people will do like number of students in class, camel cased, right? A really long variable name, which is descriptive. But I've done this one before, and it's usually just num students, something like that. And a user's first name. Sometimes people try and do a really long one. It's usually just F name. And just descriptive, right? Do your best. Really long and descriptive is fine, but it's tedious to write. Overly short is too difficult to understand. The most important thing is that you're just following those rules. Oh, and I guess I'm lying, right? I need to put a $sign in front of these. I kind of forget that we're talking about the bare syntax here, because I'm more worried about what should you call these things. Do you understand that if 10 people wrote the same program, they would all pick different variable names? Probably. And that's okay. You just got to follow the rules, try and be descriptive, try and not be overly wordy. Those are just ideas. So the next part of the presentation is a weird section. These are some functions that you'll probably never use. The only reason I'm showing them to you is if you're having a hard time with that idea of this being an interpreted or loosely typed language, these are some functions that you can use to force the type of variables. So this function is called setType. If you call it, you pass it the name of a variable and a type as a string, it will set that variable to this type. You might be wondering, why would you ever do this? Well, you're probably not going to do a lot of this. You might do this when you're working with content from a database, sending it or pulling it, but you're probably not going to use these a lot. The reason I give you these is just so you can play around with them, right? So how about go declare some variables, use this function, and so you can use getType, setType, and isType in conjunction to do some somewhat interesting examples. Let's talk about functions for a minute here. When I say this is a void function, that means this function here doesn't return any values. It just does something, right? It takes a variable and it changes the data type. It doesn't return anything. GetType is a function where you pass it a variable and it returns a string, right? A string, you're gonna pass it a variable and it'll return something like integer or float or boolean, right? It gives you something back. It doesn't just do something, it gives you something back. And isType is a boolean function. So this is a function where you call this function, pass it a variable, and it tells you true or false, right? Like either that thing is or it isn't something. Now isType isn't a function. I'm just being lazy here. There's like isString, isBoolean, isInteger. There's a different function for each type. Now the reason I show you this is just so you can play around with it. And in my little example that I've given you for the week, right, I do some fooling around with these things. Right, I set a type, I get the type. Right, you can see what I'm doing here. I encourage you to dink around with the language, create some variables, call some functions, see how it works, see how it doesn't work. So the reason I'm giving these to you is not that I think you're going to get a lot of mileage out of them. Just if you want to write some PHP and experiment with this, well, then you should now's a good time to do that. Let me show you some things here. This is probably a good time to do a little bit of XAMPP. So sorry, going detour. So let's say you wrote a script like this and you want to run it. Well, the first thing you have to understand is you can't run PHP until you've got XAMPP up and running. I do have XAMPP up and running, so I can run this. Here's what I need to do. I need to take my script here, File, Save As. Now it's very important that I put it, I'm going to my flash drive or wherever your XAMPP is installed. I'm going into that XAMPP folder. I'm going into htdocs. Anything that you want the PHP to be processed on needs to be in this folder. Let me show you what I mean by that. If I try and run this page in Firefox as is, let me pull it over here, it's going to end up looking like that, right? Like garbage. Some crazy mix of kind of looking like HTML, kind of spitting out PHP. You cannot do that. What you have to do is you have to take this file and, as I said, save it in your, wherever your XAMPP is installed, in your htdocs folder, somewhere in here. It'd be a good idea to create a folder like week 2. Anything inside of htdocs is okay. So now I open up week 2. Now I save this thing. Now I run it, and it doesn't work any better. But that's okay. I'll show you why. So notice the URL up here. If I take this, so everything up through localhost needs to be replaced. Or sorry, everything up through hdocs needs to be replaced with localhost. Once you do that, now the PHP gets rendered. Right? Notice the difference. So if you don't have XAMPP up and running, if you don't change the stub of that path to localhost, none of that works. Well, I don't know when I was supposed to introduce this to you, but I introduced it right now. I don't know if it's the most fluid time to do it, but right at the point where you're actually writing PHP, you need to understand what you need to do to make it get processed. You can't just write PHP. Your web browser doesn't know what to do with it. There needs to be some kind of web server on the back end which is capable of processing it, and that's where XAMPP comes in. So let's look at a couple more things, and then we'll kind of switch gears a little bit. So here's just some code for you. Let's look at this. So let's point out all the things that are wrong with this. So this right here looks like a variable declaration. That's invalid because that is a variable name with a space in it. You need to either turn that into an underscore or camel case it. Now that looks valid. Now the interesting thing about this is I've got this variable called side length. I also need to fix that. So here's another variable called 2 times length. That's an invalid name because it starts with a number. I don't know where the number should go, just not at the beginning. So now my variable names are legitimate, and let me show you the problem with this. So I've got this thing called side length, and I've got this thing called times len2, and I'm setting it equal to side length times 2. That's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. This is what you call an assignment statement because you're taking a variable and you're setting it equal to something. And this is what you call an expression. So I'm doing side length times 2. So 7 times 2 is 14, right? Wrong. So let's look a little bit more at side length. Side length is set to 7, but notice those quotes? Well, first off, I need a semicolon there. Secondly, when you put quotes around something, it's a string. So when you do a string times a number, how do you think that's going to work out? Well, the answer is a string, when you convert it to a number, that's what this is called. This is called an implicit type conversion. If you take a string and you convert it to a number, if I asked you to guess what happens, I bet you'd guess that it gets converted to, I don't know what you would guess, but I would guess it gets converted to a 0. 0 times 2 is 0, and this variable right here, would end up with having a value of 0 because of type problems. However, if I did this, then I'd get 7 times 2, and I'd get 14. So type does matter, but it really is only probably going to bite you for now if you make a mistake. So do understand that there are consequences to your types. And so I'm sorry, I'm thinking about this video in terms of 2 halves, because I'm about to go to our Friday office hours right in a minute here. So echoes, last thing I'll talk about. I've already talked about it a little bit. Most PHP doesn't produce any output. If you want to actually spit something out on the screen, that's where echo comes in. Single quotes versus double quotes is important. When you're echoing, generally speaking, I think you want to use double quotes. Single quotes are fine, but there's a reason for that. Let me just demonstrate it for you. So here's an echo. So I'm spitting out everything inside of those double quotes. Here we go again. I'm spitting out everything inside of those double quotes. And so here we just kind of crossed paths with another nasty thing. So concatenation is the idea of when you've got strings that you want to stick together, like a complex output. You glue multiple strings together, or sometimes you'll glue like a numeric thing or the result of a function together with some literal text like this. The concatenation character in PHP is a dot, which is super weird, but you're just going to have to get over that. In most languages, it's a plus or an ampersand or something like that. So this is going to spit out the type of my var is, right, and I end my quotes right here. Dot concatenates, and then whatever the result of that function is. And you saw the output of that a minute ago, and it looked like, right, the type of my var is integer. So where that comes from is the result of, so the type of my var is integer, and you probably could have guessed that. Let me show you the double quote versus single quote thing. I'm going to do it as the first thing on this page. So I'll say like echo, let's say I do double quotes, my var is my var, right? Very weird example. So I'm echoing something out in double quotes. Notice I'm putting a variable in there. I want to show you what this does. I save that. I refresh this. Sorry, there's not a lot of demonstration to this. Oh, I forgot a line break. But it says my var is 8. Sorry, I forgot to put a line break. Also worth pointing out that you do have to deal with that in your echoes. Remember, you're spitting out HTML, so you do need to put the line breaks in there more often than not. So now the result is that. All right, my var is 8. And now I'll show you the single quote alternative, which is a bad idea. If you want to do single quotes, so the difference here is that when you do double quotes, variables get resolved to their actual value. But when you put it in single quotes, it's going to get spit out as the literal value, which means that. Right? So do you see what I mean by double quotes are better if you're spitting out variables? Let me show you. You can do it in single quotes, but if you're going to do it in single quotes, it's going to be ugly. It's going to look like this, right? Single quote from there to there, concatenate that onto it, and then concatenate that literal value, right? If this was a class, I'd say raise your hand if anyone thinks that was better. No one would raise their hand because that was not better. That was just more difficult. Let me show you the result of that. So that worked, right? And so single quotes versus double quotes. So if you've got variables that you want to be part of your echoes, you should definitely use double quotes, because otherwise you're making your life a lot harder by using double quotes. All right, so we are over 20 minutes in. I've talked about echo, declaring variables, pretty basic stuff. But like I said, it's a busy week. It's all coming at you. So, moving along. All right, so here's another example. So say we've got a variable called side length with a value of 20, and I've got something called dim with a value of 5. And this echo right here, this is the kind of statement which would produce something. So this is going to spit out literally the area is. Notice this quote goes from here to here. I'm concatenating. And so notice I'm concatenating an expression here. An expression is what you call it when you are manipulating some variables. So side length times dim. Notice I'm doing 20 times 5. The mathematically inclined to those, you probably expect, I don't know, right? I want 100 to get spit out here because that's what 20 times 5 is. But this is pretty clearly not going to do what you expect it to do. 5, the word, is definitely not going to get resolved to the number 5. That is going to default to 0. So it's probably going to end up being 20 times 0, which is 0. Then again, this 20 right here is also being treated as a string. Notice the quotes around it. So this is going to be 0 times 0. There's so many problems with this that I don't know where to start. But on the other hand, this will spit out legitimate output. It will say the area is 0, and that's what it would spit out. All right, so let's talk about scope for a minute. So scope is a term that you use in programming languages. So there's things like global and local. Scope can be an issue in PHP, but do understand that the important thing you need to know is that when you've got multiple PHP blocks on a page, like let's say you've got a chunk of PHP at the top of the page, chunk of PHP at the bottom of the page, variables, like a variable declared at the top is available to the chunk of code at the bottom. You'll see how this works as you get a feel for it. Variables declared inside of functions are local, and we're not creating any functions today, so don't worry about that yet, but that's one of the few places where you're going to get bit by scope. So if you declare a function, understand the variables declared in that function are local to that function. Most things are more or less global in PHP, meaning that they are available throughout the page. Constants, so I don't use many constants. Some people use more constants than others. A constant is a lot like a variable in that it's a piece of memory that you're assigning a symbolic name to and a value, and it has an inferred type. Constants just cannot be changed. So if you wanted to create a variable which you were going to assign one value to and you were never going to change it, then a constant's the right call. Like I said, I just don't use a lot of constants. Here's the syntax for that. Literally define, name of the variable, right? I say variable because that's kind of the right word, but it's a constant, and then the value. Notice there's no $sign. A convention, which is just something that people try and do to make the code more readable, is that when you declare a variable, all uppercase, and they generally don't camel case them. They will use underscores. That's why I'm kind of really anti-underscores, because when you see a lot of underscores, you're oftentimes looking at a constant. We're not going to use a lot of constants, but I can't not talk about constants. If you want to use constants, go ahead and knock yourself out. My little example code for the week. Oh, I also probably this time I'm going to try and make clear, like here's what a constant looks like. So that's a variable, or sorry, a constant called sales tax with a value of 0.07. Notice that syntax. I'm not talking about all these examples because I gave them to you in the weekly content under code examples, so you can just see some stuff. And really, you should just write anytime you can come up with any idea of, I wonder if this would work. I wonder if that would work. You should do that and experiment and get better at this. So arrays. All right, this is the scariest thing I think that we're talking about today because arrays are probably new to you. So arrays are a singular, you could think of them like a variable, but it's a variable that holds many values in it. And so, let's say we had a zoo full of animals. One way you could store all the animals in there would be, have a variable called animal1 equals cat, animal2 equals dog, animal3 equals zebra, animal4 is horse, animal5 other horse, right? It'd be a real nightmare to keep track of that. So an easier way to do that would be to create an array. So just a single name. So here we've got this thing called my zoo, and it's got positions in it. So like the first thing in the zoo, the second thing in the zoo, the third thing in the zoo. Now here's kind of an interesting convention. You will get used to this with programming. There's a good chance you already know about it. But when we talk about arrays in programming languages, they are zero indexed. So when I say the first thing, I mean the thing in spot 0. The thing in spot 1 is actually the second thing. That is actually the third thing. And so when you talk about an array, it has a symbolic name, like a variable, but it has what's called index positions, right? So index positions are like 0, 1, 2, 3. There's not negative positions, but do know that they start in 0. The same kind of thing is apparent when you work with strings. For those of you that have worked with strings before, which is probably most of you, strings are 0 indexed. In other words, like the first character of a string is in spot 0. So if that helps you to understand what this is, well, that's good. So arrays are an interesting thing because we're not going to create them in this class. I am just showing you the syntax here. So they have positions and they have values. The other kind of way that you can work with arrays, so there's indexed arrays like this, and there's associative arrays. Now the weird thing is, so associative arrays are less common in the wild, but in PHP we use associative arrays all the time. Not because we choose to, but they're just kind of a part of it. So things that are passed with get and post, we're actually using arrays for those, and I'll show you what that means in a minute here. So this is one valid way to create an array and put things in it. Here's another valid way to create an array and put things in it. Right, so this is an array called age, and notice this big kind of ugly weird function assignment statement. So this would be an array called age. In spot Peter, there'd be a value of 35. In spot Ben, there'd be a value of 37. In spot Joe, there'd be a value of 43. right? That's a lot different than we talked about here. This is an associative array because the values are in numeric positions starting at 0. Associative arrays are when the indices, and we call those indices like 0, 1, 2. When the indices have names like Peter and Ben and Joe, that's called an associative array. Like I said, it's less common in the wild, but you'll see pretty shortly why I'm talking about this. If this seems like a lot and like a weird thing to cover this early in the course, it is, but you will see why we're doing it. So this right here is the same as this right here, right? So an array called age. Spot Peter has a value of 35. Spot Ben has a value of 37. Spot Joe has a value of 43. Notice I'm putting quotes around those. That's weird. Those would be treated as strings. Probably not a great idea, but it all depends. So what in the heck? Why are we talking about associative arrays? Literally, that is something that, if I was just teaching you about the fundamentals of a language, that would be way down the road. But the reason you need to know about it, if we talked about get and post a lot, it's part of the content for the week, so get and post might still be new to you. It might not, depending on where you're at in terms of the week. But when you're processing information from a form, you're processing it using either the get or the post method. Talked about this a little bit already. I don't know what already means because I don't know what you've viewed. But when you pass information via the get method, it's visible in the URL. When you pass something with the post method, it is passed behind the scenes. It's invisible. You have no choice but to get a good handle on this during the weekly videos and the lab. So if it's scary right now, that's okay. You'll learn it when you do it soon enough. So where these come into play is when you want to get these things. So when you want to retrieve these pieces of information, you need to understand that they are part of these associative arrays. So if you're using the get method, all the fields in your form are available via that array right there. So that's super ugly looking, right? $_get. That $_get is the name of the array which has all the information from your form in it, if you were using the get method. The other array, $_post, that's the array which has all the information from your form if you're using the post method. We use get more often than post, especially early in the course. But that's if you're wondering where does this horrendous syntax come from, that's what it is, right? So it's an array, and you notice that array because you see that square bracket notation right there. That is the name of the form field. Hopefully that helps. Like I said, I feel like I'm overdoing the lecture right now. I'm looking at my timer and I'm over 30 minutes in and we're not done with this. I'm trying to just kind of set a foundation in place. I expect this to make a lot more sense when you do the lab. So this is how we process information from our forms, and those are arrays. I guess I don't have to sit here and tell you what that means, but I want you to try and maybe understand that that's an array. It's an associative array. All right, so now on to operators, which certainly could have done first, but I'm not. So these are the tools that you have available to you to represent variables or to manipulate variables and values. So you got your normal things like plus, minus, divide, times. This percent sign is mod, so it's a mod operator. You may or may not have seen that. So the mod operator, you probably have seen that before. You may not. It's the remainder operator. In other words, you use mod to do something like this. So if I go like 5 mod 2, that means so 2 goes into 5 2 times with 1 left over. It's kind of hard. You have to think back to grade school days when you were learning long division, but it's the number that would be left over. It's very useful when you're talking about things like oftentimes working with time. Minus, that could be used for subtraction. It could also be used for negation. Plus plus, that is an incrementation operator. Like if you do I plus plus, it means add 1 to it. So like let's say I had a value of 1. If you wrote I plus plus, I is now going to be equal to 2. Minus minus, that's a decrement operator. So if you had I with a value of 7 and you did I minus minus, it's going to be 6. Plus equals and minus equals, these are combination operators. They're kind of like this. Like if you did something like, let's say I was equal to 3 and you did I plus equals 3, you'd be taking the value of I and adding 3 to it. So like plus plus is the same thing as plus equals 1, if that makes sense. So pre and post. So notice the plus plus and minus minus. I'm telling you that this right there and that right there are different expressions. 99% of the time, it's not going to make any difference. Both of them will add 1 to I, but this does something a little different than that. It all depends on the context of what you're doing, but more or less, this would potentially have the effect of updating the value of I or adding 1 to it before you do whatever you're going to do next. And this would add I after you do what you're going to do next. Like I said, I think a lot of people don't really understand these, how these the difference between those two. I'm just telling you it does exist. I don't think it's going to affect you in this course. It may never affect you, but those are technically different. And this operator right here, the @ symbol, that suppresses errors. So let's say you wrote a piece of code and it spits out a warning, like let me try and make some kind of a warning. Gosh, how could I make a warning? I'll try and do this. All right, so this should cause an error because my var, like what is my var, right? It needs a $sign in front of it. I don't even know what this is going to do. Trust me, I make lots of errors, but I don't try to make errors usually. All right, so I've got a notice. So it's like, what the heck is my var is what it's saying. So error suppression operators are not valid. I will ding you if I ever catch you using these. You put an error suppression operator in front of something if you just want the error to not be displayed. That is pretty hacky. So, I mean, there are times when it's somewhat appropriate to use, right? Like error goes away, but it doesn't fix the problem, right? You're just putting it's like cleaning your room and shoving everything under your bed. It's not any cleaner that way. And you're getting the warning because you made a mistake. And I can tell you, I've been writing PHP for about 15, almost 20 years now. And I've suppressed some operators through the years that rear their heads and the site completely breaks, later on. So you shouldn't do that, but you should know about it. There are a few times when I let you do it, especially when you're, if you don't know how to fix something. I guess you don't really have much of a choice, but it's always better to try and fix it. So, on the note of error suppression, let's talk about different kinds of errors. There's notices, warnings, and exceptions. Notices are what I just showed you. Like the kind of thing that PHP, I don't know if you noticed, but PHP did know. It took a guess about the mistake that I made and how to fix it. It didn't stop the script from running. It didn't really have any negative effects. It was just something that I messed up on. Notices should be fixed. They're the least serious. Warnings are an error which is a little bit more serious. The script will continue to run, but it's a higher level of an error. And exceptions are the highest level of error. When you do something like an exception, let me try and make an exception. Like that, right? There's no way PHP is going to be able to figure out what to do with that, and that should be an exception. Even that was a notice. All right, so it didn't know what to do. Trust me, we will get exceptions. But so let's look at how PHP handled that. So it didn't know what to do. It took a guess that I just meant it was a literal value, and it just spit that out. I don't think I really have the tools. I don't have a great example of an exception right now, but I promise you will make exceptions later on. And exceptions will just crash your code right there. Like the page won't even spit out. So you got 3 grades of those. Relational operators. All right, so this is the last big chunk of the lesson for today. So this is like later than, greater than, less than. You've seen these before. The prerequisite for this class is some kind of programming. You've seen these before. This is less than or equal to. This is greater than or equal to. This is checking for equality. So if you're saying like, is x equal to 5? Well, then there's a double equals sign. There's also triple equals. Triple equals is used to determine whether something is equal in value and type, right? Like so, let's say you had a double 7 and an integer 7. Well, those would be equal, but their types aren't equal. You're not going to use this very often, but you should know what it is. This not operator can be used with these as well. Like so, if you wanted to say something was not equal, you could put the not sign in front of it. Perfectly reasonable thing to do. So these are usually used in conjunction with an if statement. Now, if statements in PHP are definitely pretty straightforward. So it's entirely possible you haven't seen curly brackets before. So if, keyword if, so if, and here's my condition. So this would assume there's some variable called login. So, but I mean, this is a silly example because what's correct, but anyways. So if, this is a conditional statement right here. So I'm checking a variable or something against something. If that is equal to that, then do something. Otherwise, do something else, right? This isn't even close to valid PHP, but that's okay. On that note, I'm going to get rid of that. But notice the syntax here. So if that thing's true, do that. Else, do that. Just take a second look at this, because depending on where you came from programming-wise, this may or may not be the same. This is called a condition. I always wrap my conditions in parentheses. You should too. It definitely helps to keep things simple. And these curly braces, so everything in these curly braces is a conditional, which if this thing evaluates to true, then what's going to happen in those curly braces is going to happen. You could have 20 things in here if you wanted. It's everything between the curly braces. This is probably a good time to point out my personal syntax. I always put my opening curly brace on the same line as the if statement. Some people put it down there. That's not wrong. If you scour the internet, I think the majority of people actually do it like that. I just do it like that because I think it's a little bit cleaner to look at. Another thing, just stylistically, notice there's my closing if. You can definitely put the else on the same line as the closing bracket. Now here's a big pro tip. You're going to have tons of ifs eventually. What I always do is at the end of the closing, at the end of the big if statement, I put a comment. We'll talk about those in a minute, and I'll say what it is. If login. Because I'm telling you, you're going to have scripts with 10 different ifs in them, and it's really, really hard to figure out. One of the big problems you're going to have is you're going to have trouble opening and closing your curly braces. Because sometimes you get code that looks like this, right? And that's literally the hardest thing in the world to figure out. Because then you start looking at your code, and you're like, well, what is that supposed to belong to? What's that supposed to belong to? Well, if you comment out all those kind of naked ending curly braces, then you're not going to be asking questions about where does this go, where does that go. You also don't need these curly braces. I might as well just tell you this. If what you're doing is only one line of code, you can just write the one line of code. I do feel like that's pretty sloppy, so I don't do it. It's not wrong. Just talking a little style here. So the other kind of complement to this is an else if. So here's an if. So if shape equals circle, then area is pi r squared, right? That's a realistic looking example. This needs an opening curly brace right there, right? It runs from there to there. Now, if you have multiple things you're checking for, like more than two, then you're going to need an else if. Notice else if is just mashed together. Else if shape is equal to square, area is h squared, else, and that looks like a triangle. You could write this like else if shape equals, triangle. You could do that, but an else is useful. Like if there's only one case left, then an else is definitely the most elegant way to handle that. So you don't always have to have an else if. You don't always have to have an else, but you do definitely have to have an if. So you're checking for at least one case. Generally speaking, you do want to have an else, which is going to be like that bucket that catches everything else. There's no way that decision structures should be new to you in this class. Some of you took Introduction to Programming, some of you just have experience with it. This is one of the most fundamental things. I'm just showing you the PHP syntax, right? I can't tell you about this, right? I mean, this isn't an Introduction to Programming class. I'm just showing you how things work in PHP. And I'm trying to do a little bit of an overview because, like I said, you all have different backgrounds. All right, the other one that you can use is a switch statement. So a switch statement is an alternate to an if-else. I personally don't like switch statements. Not that there's anything wrong with them, but me as an instructor, I literally teach C, I teach PHP, I teach some JavaScript, I teach Visual Basic, and in every language, the if statement is the same, more or less in every language, But switch statements vary dramatically from language to language. So it just kind of drives me crazy to remember the alternate syntax, if that makes sense. So I don't use a lot of switches, but a lot of people do use switches. This doesn't do anything that you can't do with an if statement. It's a little shorter. So here's what it looks like. So you write keyword switch. Then in parentheses, you write the name of the variable that you want to look at. Then there's a big old set of curly braces, which wrap up the whole switch statement. Then case. So like, let's say that this was, there's examples in your code for the week, so I'm not too worried about it. Just like, let's say this is a name. So and this would say like case Ken, right? So you're saying is var name equal to Ken is what that says. Notice that's a colon after it, not a semicolon. And you'd say and do something, right? Like hello Ken. And then you have to put a break statement. If you don't put a break statement, all the other things are going to happen as well. So telling you at the end of every little case, you need a break unless you want everything to happen. All right, case, something else, do something else, break, and then the default roughly corresponds to an else. So if you want to think about how this would apply to like an if statement, this would be like if the first case, this would kind of be like your else if, and this would kind of be like your else. You can use these or not use them. Like I said, I'm not going to use a lot of them, but some of what you're going to learn in this class is going to be from you just looking at other people's examples, experimenting, reading books, articles, looking at code. I'm just telling you, if you ever see a switch statement, it's just a logical alternative to an if. And it's a little bit more, there are some nice applications of this, but ultimately it doesn't do anything that you can't do with something else, like an if. All right, these three functions, I wish I could put these off to next week, because I know it's painful to me to know how much content I'm covering this week. But I also know that you have to have all of this stuff to be able to create a functional PHP script. Like what we're doing this week isn't that interesting. I mean, it's kind of interesting in like the big picture, but you really have to have all this stuff to make a functional example. So these are validation functions. They can be used as validation functions. So isSet is the most commonly used one. What this does is generally we use this to determine whether a form was submitted or not. I think you'll get a better feel for that later. IsNull literally just returns the opposite of isSet. You could just put like a not symbol in front of isSet and it would give you all the same things that IsNull does. And empty is the function I'm asking you to use this week. Empty determines whether an actual value was submitted. And you'll get I'm just talking about this right now. There's a reading about this for the week. It's a big part of it's a, moderate part of your lab. I feel like at this point, this is all I can tell you is kind of what they're used for. I don't think you're going to use this one pretty much ever, because isSet is the same thing with a not in front of it. And empty is something that you're going to be using this week. But basically, we usually use these functions to determine whether something exists. Like, for example, if I go $_get name, like that, what I would use that for, I'd say, like, hey, go look at the URL of this page. Was there something passed with a value of name? Or, sorry, with a name of name. So, how about, I don't like saying name of name, but how about this? What this says, basically, I would use this to say, go look at the URL of this page. Is there something up in the URL that says fname equals something? Like, it either is there or it isn't there. I think I demonstrate this pretty decently in the lab. And the last thing is comments. Right, so different languages have different comment syntax. There's single line comments and there's multiple line comments. Comments are used to make your code more readable. If you're ever doing something weird or not quite sure why your code does what it does, it's a really good idea for you to put some comments in there so I can look at it. So single line comment is just meant to when you just have a line, like you want to, maybe you're explaining why you did something with a variable. Multiple line comments, this is also called block comments. Generally, it'll open here, close here, and you've got paragraph style comments. These are generally like up at the top of your file where you're putting your name on it, saying what this project is supposed to do as a whole. These are used for single line comments. At this point, I want to reiterate, see this demo? So I don't really give you live PHP for this class because at the minimum, you need to write it. But I did give you a JPEG of what this looks like. And pretty much everything I talked about, everything from arrays to concatenation to ifs, right? A bunch of if examples, even a little bit of form stuff is here. I gave you this file, which is just, it's the reason I give this to you is that if you want to test this stuff out, you should just experiment with your own code. But if you're lacking the inspiration or it's not clear enough what you could do, you could retype this on your own. I like the idea of you retyping it because you're going to make mistakes when you retype it, and so much of what we do is related to debugging. And so debugging is that process of figuring out what the errors are and fixing those errors. So there's some examples for you to look at and play around with. This was a super long PowerPoint. I had this idea that these were going to be short, but they end up being about twice as long as I'm expecting them to be, and I think that's probably going to be a theme going forward. For an online class, that's just I feel like I want to try and do everything I can to talk about these things. But ultimately, I also try and incorporate them into the labs and the learning videos. So I hope this helped to get a good overview of all the tools that you're going to need for the week. So this week you're going to need to get XAMPP up and running, otherwise your PHP is not going to work, and there's going to be a lot of experimentation. I also want to reiterate that you should take advantage of the Friday labs. It is Friday, it's 11:40 right now, and no one came to today's lab, and that makes sense because it's entirely possible that this whole first week was just kind of review for you. But if this is rough for you, and I expect that it's going to be rough for a lot of you, then you should come see me on Friday and we'll talk about this, and maybe I can help it make a little bit more sense. I think this is a tough class to do online. I hope you can see that I'm doing what I can to make it available to you, but ultimately, if there's parts of this that aren't coming together for you, and there's always students who don't get this at the first shot, then make sure you come to those labs on Friday where we can sit down and talk about some of these things. Alright, so that's the lecture for week 2. A lot of stuff. Very important that you go through the learning videos. Hopefully that's going to clear up a lot of the things. Make sure you practice. And thanks for watching.